Dan?
Good afternoon, Mr Cantlay. Mr McGregor.
Thank you. Mr Cantlay, just before lunch we were discussing the environmental matrix. There's just a few more questions I have in relation to that. Miss Goldsmith from NHS Lothian, who was the Senior Responsible Officer, she told the inquiry that there was a desire on the part of NHS Lothian not to effectively waste the money that had been spent on the capital stage of the project whenever it turned to being a revenue-funded project. So that included work that had been done on the reference design and the environmental matrix in particular. Do you recall Mott MacDonald giving specific advice in terms of whether the work that had been done for the capital project, including the environmental matrix, would be appropriate for a revenue-funded project?
So what I recall happened effectively is and I became involved in the project when it turned from capital to revenue. So I do recall, this is back in the early sort of months of 2011. So I do recall a number of conversations with NHS Lothian and with SFT. In effect, there was two moving parts, I guess, that we were trying to juggle with. One moving part was this new MPD model, and while contractually it had particular changes from a PFI type model, there was kind of ambition from SFT to maybe look at how the procurement associated with MPD was different and should we use reference designs, etc. So one moving part was trying to, and this was obviously a bit of a pathfinder for healthcare in terms of MPD. So one moving part was trying to understand, what the procurement process with an MPD would do, how you would use reference designs, etc. And then a separate moving part was, Lothian had been going through a process of developing the design on the understanding that it was going to be capitally funded, and so had gone through the process in that way, and so therefore now had a partially developed design. And so how you use that, given the operational functionality, there'd been a lot of clinical user groups, etc. So it's how you best use that and avoid it being complete abortive costs. So what we're trying to do was work out a way of running the procurement that B used the reference design where it was appropriate to do so. So in terms of your question, did we provide advice to Lothian, NHS Lothian on that? Yeah, we did a number of advisory papers, which, there's a number of iterations, and I think the number of iterations reflected just, the amount of thought and reconsideration of particular points that needed to be done to come up with that balance of MPD procurement and use of reference designs, and the fact that a partially developed design existed.
Thank you. And in terms of your own involvement in the project, you're obviously, tells you're involved from 2011, 2012 when it becomes revenue funded. Do you stay involved throughout the project until financial close, or is there a point where you, although you're still involved, you take a step back and other individuals such as Graham Greer come in and take on a more lead role?
Yeah, so I think there was probably 3 stages in that. So from 2011 up to OJU, I had quite a hands-on role. Once we got into the competitive dialogue or procurement process, my role was more, overseeing. So I attended a lot of the dialogue sessions, but I wasn't getting involved in reviewing the submissions or anything like that. I was supporting from a senior level with a whole team of Malt MacDonald people involved in the details. I was providing guidance and support to my team, and NHS Lothian and Brian was keen for me to provide support also at the dialogue meetings. So that was a lighter touch than my initial 2 years. And then once we got into the evaluation process, appointment of preferred bidder, that's really when I stepped away in terms of active ongoing role on the project, and it was more attending key meetings, providing advice to the likes of Graham Greer. So I would probably describe my role as almost 3 levels of input, starting off the most heaviest, ending up being, a fairly light touch.
Thank you. Given that role that you've described, you might not be able to assist with my next question, but I'll raise it with you nonetheless. There seems to be a difference in recollections between various witnesses that have given evidence to the inquiry in terms of what prospective tenderers were told about the status of the environmental matrix in the period to financial close, and in particular at competitive dialogue stages. So from the start of the procurement exercise to competitive dialogue, one group of witnesses say we're told that the reference design is fixed, that the environmental matrix is a client brief, it can't be changed. Other witnesses have said, no, that's not what prospective tenderers were told. They were told that the design risk sat with them, that this couldn't be relied upon, and they had to produce their own designs. Do you have a recollection of any such conversations taking place during your involvement in the project?
Vague. So I can't be 100% accurate here, but my memory and recollection was that anything round about which bits are mandatory and which bits aren't would very much have stayed, around what was set out in Volume 1 of the ITPD, which is the mandatory elements are those elements of design relating to operational functionality. I certainly have no recollection of anybody ever suggesting the likes of the environmental matrix was mandatory.
And again, presumably that's consistent with your position, which is the intention behind the documents we've been through is that those documents were a draft to be developed as opposed to being a fixed client brief.
Yeah, and it would also be in line with my understanding of the risk profile in a revenue-funded project and what can and can't, be mandatory in terms of transferring design responsibility and risk.
I'd like to move on now and ask you some questions about the role of Malt MacDonald. One witness that gave evidence to the inquiry described the role of Malt MacDonald during the procurement exercise in the period to financial close as being akin to a shadow design team. Would you have any observations on that characterisation of Malt MacDonald's role?
So, firstly, I don't really recognise the terminology shadow design team in the context of a revenue funded project. I think shadow design team is probably a terminology that's used in design and build projects which are capitally funded when talking about the public sector. So, I have done revenue funded projects, for a number of years. And I just don't necessarily recognise that as something that is terminology, because it's always been technical advisor, and that kind of aligns with what I think the role of the technical advisor is, which again is directly related to where the design and design responsibility and design risk sits. Thank you.
If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, from Bundle 2, page 28, which is the contract between Lothian Health Board and Malt MacDonald Limited. Bundle 2, page 28. And if I could ask you to look on, please, to page 86. Probably helpful if we zoom in, but just so we're looking at the same document, it should have in the top left-hand corner, Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences Technical Advisor Scope. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then we see a description of items set out, and then there's various parties that would be providing those roles. So there's Davis Langdon, Malt MacDonald, Thomson Gray and Turner and Townsend. Do you see that?
Yes.
So the first entry, management and coordination, says act as lead technical advisor and point of contact for NHSL client. That's Malt MacDonald with a fee of £121,914. So what were Malt MacDonald doing in terms of acting as the lead technical advisor, just in general terms?
So as we talked about earlier, the technical advisor team is a whole combination of different disciplines. So this is about joining that all together and being the point of contact. So it's providing a managed technical advisory service and engaging with NHS Lothian. So that's very much for the leadership of the team and making sure we deliver services in a integrated way.
And then if we look down to entry 10, you see it says prepare invitation to partake in dialogue, ITPD, including output specification, payment mechanism, etc. for procurement process, all prepared in association with client legal and financial advisors with a sum of £111,494. Is that effectively a separate fee for the physical preparation of the ITPD that we've looked at?
Yeah, so that, reading it, that is the development of the technical components of the ITPD, whether that is the technical components of Volume 1 or the output specification, the board's construction requirements effectively, yeah.
And then if we look at item 13, it's prepare reference design documentation as appropriate for inclusion in ITPD. How does that entry differ from what we see at entry 10?
So that is about taking reference design developed in a ring-fence team and presenting it to the bidders in a way with all the sort of narrative round about here's the reference design, these bits are mandatory, these bits aren't. In terms of why it's a different line item, I think it's just separated out for particular note because, you know, we were moving into an MPD, there's going to be a reference design. So it could have been included in 10, but I think it was just flagged as a separate task just to make sure everybody was clear that, you know, something, you know, a bit different to what had been done before was getting done here.
And then if we look at entry 16, just slightly further down, it says check reference design for compliance with all appropriate NHSL and legislative guidelines and requirements, list as pre-agreed with NHSL and identify any derogations. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So what did Malt MacDonald have to do in terms of entry 16?
Basically seek, well, yeah, as we can see, there is 5 days allowed for that task. So in effect, it was getting confirmation or otherwise that the reference design had been developed in accordance with those requirements. So either confirmation wholesale or an understanding from the reference design team as to any non-compliances stroke derogations.
One of the issues that's before the inquiry is whether certain values included within the environmental matrix, which forms part of the reference design, which forms part of the ITPD, complied with published guidelines, including SHTM 0301. Should the inquiry understand that entry 16 required Malt MacDonald to check that the reference design complied with all relevant published guidance?
No, so this wasn't an independent check of the reference design. NHS Lothian were already paying for the development of a reference design through that contract. And this was effectively a requirement to on behalf of that team, be clear that it is or isn't complying with the with the guidance. So it is definitely not a check of the reference design that it complies. Simply because why would you do that? Because there's already a competent team appointed to do it. Secondly, it is a reference design and therefore it's going to be used in a certain way. And thirdly, 5 days to do a full check just wouldn't be anywhere near to what would be needed.
So the entry that says check reference design for compliance with all appropriate NHSL and legislative guidelines, your position is Mott MacDonald weren't, as part of their responsibilities, required to check the reference design for actual compliance. They just to ask the people that had prepared the environmental matrix if it complied with the relevant guidance.
Correct, yeah.
And for simply asking someone else if they'd complied with their obligations, Mott MacDonald were to be paid £2,605.
Yeah, to go through the process of getting to that point, yeah.
In your previous statement and when you gave evidence before in May of 2022, we covered off the fact that Mott MacDonald checked with Hulley and Kirkwood as to whether the environmental matrix that had been drafted did comply with published guidance. And just to refresh your memory, if I could ask you to have in front of you, please, bundle 4, page 322. That should be an email from Andrew Duncan to Thomas Brady dated the 28th of February 2012. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says, Tom, there's an action in the reference design team to confirm that the reference design complies with NHS guidance and key legislation. I attach the requirement schedule for each of the reference designers to respond to. We require a statement from each designer to confirm that the reference design complies with the requirement schedule. Should it not fully comply, then each designer shall confirm that the reference design complies with the requirement schedule with a schedule of derogations. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is that the request to Hulley and Kirkwood to say, is your environmental matrix going to comply?
Yes.
And then if we look on to page 324, you see the document with Nightingale's, BMJ Architects, Hulley and Kirkwood, etc., RHSC plus DCN, Little France Edinburgh, reference design proposals, and it's dated the 16th of March 2012.
Yes.
Then if we look on to page 325, see the bold boxes. If we just perhaps pick the one up that says Health Technical Memoranda and Scottish Health Technical Memoranda, it says we have followed SHTMs and also HTMs when there is no Scottish equivalent. Do you see that?
Yes.
So that's the confirmation provided by Hulley and Kirkwood in relation to the compliance of the environmental matrix with the published guidance. So that's given in March of 2012. If we could go within bundle 4 to page 131. This is the version of the environmental matrix that was issued with the ITPD. Now, it's dated the 19th of September 2012. Do you recall whether in the period from March to September, or really in the September, if Hulley and Kirkwood were asked to refresh that confirmation that they'd provided that the final iteration of the environmental matrix complied with published guidance, including SHTMs and HTMs?
I can't, I'm not aware of whether that was asked or not. I'm also not clear on to what extent there was any changes between 13th of March and 19th of September, which may or may not have required that confirmation. But I would assume that, there wasn't any change of significance, that needed a change to derogation paper, because if there was to be further derogations, then I would have assumed that they would be reflected in a revised paper. So I don't know, because I wasn't involved in the reference design team, but you know, and therefore don't know whether they were asked that to do that or not.
So although we saw in the contract that there's an obligation to check, as you said, with the reference design team, that would be someone else within Malton McDonald that would be actually seeking that final confirmation.
Yeah, so I can't quite recall. Andy Duncan, I can't quite recall what his role was in terms of the reference design, but I specifically wasn't involved in the reference design because I was so heavily involved in the procurement, design the procurement process.
I just raise it as a matter of fairness, because Mr O'Donnell from Hull and Kirkwood, his position in evidence before the inquiry was that he gave the confirmation in the March, work continues to the September, but he didn't recollect anyone from Malton McDonald actually asking for a final confirmation. But again, should we understand that anyone within Malton McDonald that was seeking that confirmation, that wouldn't be your role to do for the reasons you've given?
Yeah, it's correct, yeah.
Again, this may be a technical issue that you can assist with, but do you know if Hull and Kirkwood were given a bespoke database of intent activity database by NHS Lothian or by Malton McDonald when they were developing the environmental matrix?
So I was going to ask whether you mean under the BAM contract or under the MPD contract, but either way, I don't know.
I think under either, my question would be the same.
I don't know. I can't answer that.
Thank you. If we move on just to the competitive dialogue process, my understanding from what you've said in your evidence was you were involved in the project in the competitive dialogue stages, but not in the sense of being involved in any of the technical sessions that were being undertaken. Would it be other individuals from Malton McDonald that were providing input at the various competitive dialogue sessions?
Yeah, so we had a whole team, that covered various disciplines, whether it's architectural, mechanical, electrical, facilities management, and from memory, the way the dialogue was set up, there was dialogue with each bidder over 3 days in a week. So there was a preparation meeting on the Monday. There was then a day with each bidder, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and there was a wrap-up meeting on the Friday. And on any particular day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there tended, from memory, to be a general meeting for the first part of the day. And then I think it split into disciplines. So there was maybe a design and construction meeting, a facilities management meeting, a legal meeting, whatever other meeting, strategic and management meeting. So I would have attended the preparation day on the Monday. I would have attended the plenary session, at the start of each day. And then I can't recall, which bits I attended, but I from memory, I wouldn't have been key to any of the particular disciplines. I would have been at that initial opening session with each bidder, and then probably went to a number of the subgroups, but not necessarily on a consistent manner. I think that's my recollection.
And in terms of, there came a point in time where NHS Lothian takes the decision to close competitive dialogue and invite final tenders. Were you involved in giving advice to NHS Lothian on that decision, or would that be colleagues within Malton McDonald?
So I can't recall to what extent. So I wouldn't have been involved. Again, I wouldn't have been involved in the detail of what I might have been involved in, and I can't recall because it's so long ago. Is those discussions which are effectively receiving views from the different parts of the evaluation team, and I think I probably was involved with conversations with Brian and the likes of, right, are we now ready to close dialogue? So I can't recall, but I suspect I would have been, yeah.
But in terms of if you were asked directly by Mr Curry, should we be closing dialogue, would you be relying on what you were told by colleagues as opposed to first-hand information you would have had? Because, as you said, you weren't involved in the technical assessment.
Yeah, well, that goes for everything. Yeah, I was leading the team, so it wasn't in the detail of any of it. I was making sure all the different bits were, moving along in a coordinated way.
And would the same apply in relation to the assessment of tenders? So dialogue closes, final tenders come in, the tenders are assessed. Am I correct from what you said in evidence? You weren't involved in the actual assessment process itself. That would be other individuals within Mott MacDonald.
Yeah, so there was, again, when it comes to evaluation of the tenders, my recollection and what would normally happen is there is subgroups reviewing specific bits, and for every bid submission requirement, there'll be a number of people allocated with reviewing that particular question. They all do their own evaluation. They come together to form a consensus score. I don't remember being involved in any of the detailed evaluation. What I was probably involved in was, I think there was something called the core evaluation panel where those subgroups reported into. So that was them saying for bidder X, question 3, we have awarded a score of Y.
Thank you. So again, if we're thinking about, for example, different solutions put in by different tenderers, one bidder, bidder C, marks up the environmental matrix, IHSL doesn't, you wouldn't be involved in that granular level of assessment of tenders?
No.
In relation to the approach that was adopted to assessing tenders, did you have an awareness of the general approach that was going to be adopted as opposed to how technical individuals went about the task?
Yes, because that general approach manifests itself in the evaluation criteria that gets set out in Volume 1 of the ITPD. And therefore what questions need to be asked of bidders, what information needs to be provided as part of the bids. So that all gets thought about in the whole at the start. And then, the information is put in Volume 1 so that bidders can understand what they have to do. And then NHS Lothian, with the help of its advisors, would develop a evaluation handbook, or manual, which is effectively explaining how the evaluation is going to proceed. And from memory, it was very similar to how we'd done evaluations on other healthcare PPP projects that I'd been involved in. And so, I am generally familiar with that process. And so we'd have been generally familiar with what was going to be happening here.
So Mr Greer's evidence to the inquiry in relation to the pass-fail questions, his evidence, as I understood it, was that effectively statements of compliance made by tenderers in their tenders, they were really taken at face value. They weren't interrogated in a greater level of detail. Was that your understanding as to what should have taken place?
So it's important to be clear about what the tender is actually presenting. So bidders are bidding to design and construct the hospital. Bidders are not presenting in their bid a fully developed design. Bidders are presenting in their bid their approach to how they will do the design. And those approaches are supplemented with various design deliverables appropriate to how much design a bidder could do in a competitive environment at their own risk in that procurement process. So going back to the question, something like the C21 compliance with board's construction requirements, that question is your design, once complete, going to be in compliance with the board's construction requirements? You can't do a detailed assessment of the final design at tender stage because it doesn't exist. So therefore, you're asking for confirmation that they will, in carrying out the design and construction, comply with the BCRs, and therefore you're taking a statement which is, yes, we will, at face value.
So if we look, for example, to IHSL's assessment pro forma, that's bundle 8, page 92. So bundle 8, page 92. So this is the assessment of C8, clarity, robustness and quality of M&E engineering, design and proposals. So we're through the pass-fail and we're now into looking at the detailed quality assessment against the 1.06 weighted criteria. You'll see that the reviewer's comments at the top there are lacking detail on design philosophy and BCR compliance. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you just help to put in context, how would a reviewer put lacking detail on design philosophy and BCR compliance if, as you've said, you just have to take things at face value because you're not going to have the detailed design at the tender stage?
Sorry, I'm just trying to work out what this shows. Okay, sorry. I was trying to align the rows and what they were. So that, yeah, you're referring to lacking detail on design philosophy and BCR compliance, which is the note in response to the bid submission requirement above, which is annotated 1, an engineering design control and operational philosophy statement. Fine. Okay, sorry, I was just getting that clear in my head. So yeah, obviously So again, I wasn't involved in the details, so I'm passing comment on what I think the situation here is. So an engineering design control and operational statement has been included within the bid. It's been reviewed, and it seems to me that whoever's reviewed it thinks that it could have more detail in relation to some particular issues. So there's obviously something there. And there's perhaps not as much detail as there could have been. So that doesn't mean to say it's no good. It doesn't mean to say it's not satisfactory. I think what is flagging is that there isn't as much detail as there could be.
And then if we look over the page onto page 93, you see the final entry at the bottom under C 8.3. It says, while bidders are required. Zoom in if we can. Page 93. You see C 8.3, whilst bidders. Page 93. Just towards the bottom, C 8.3, whilst bidders are required. Whilst bidders are required to undertake their own design, the board has provided a draft environmental matrix as part of the ITPD documentation. Bidders must confirm acceptance of the board's environmental matrix, highlighting any proposed changes on an exception basis. And you'll see the reviewer's comment there is good response. Again, just thinking back to the comment you made earlier that really statements just have to be taken at face value because you're not at this stage having a detailed design. Why would someone be putting good response in then?
So again, having not been involved, and I don't know whose response this actually is, I can't confirm what is written, led to somebody deciding it was a good response. So I don't think I can, shed light on that because it wasn't me doing the evaluation.
Thank you, Mr Cantlay. So we come to a point whereby bids go in, the bids are assessed, and then NHS Lothian have to make a decision in terms of who's going to be appointed as preferred bidder. Do you provide advice to NHS Lothian at that point in the procurement exercise?
In terms of, sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so we get to a point whereby bids are submitted, bids are assessed, and NHS Lothian has to make a decision on appointing a preferred bidder. Did you give any advice to NHS Lothian at that point?
So again, I'm sure I was involved in the code evaluation team. So it's quite a mechanical process. The evaluation methodology sets out the specific steps. So, from the compliance, completeness check through to the pass-fail criteria, through to the scoring, how then quality is combined with price to come up with the ultimate. That all follows a very prescribed evaluation methodology. And then, out of that comes a series of scoring for each bidder, which then selects the bidder. So I guess if I was part of, which I think I was, the core evaluation team, I would have been supporting Lothian and having a conversation about, right, here's the outcome of the evaluation. Are we happy that all the different parts of the team have followed the evaluation methodology, and perhaps even had a conversation to challenge a couple of things? I don't know. I can't recall. So I can't remember what specific advice I would have been given, but I anticipate I would have been involved in conversations to, say that yes, evaluation has been carried out in accordance with the methodology that we said it would be.
I appreciate we're talking about events nearly 10 years ago, Mr Cantlay, so it's maybe easier if I just take you to a couple of documents. If I could ask you to have in front of you a Mott MacDonald letter of the 4th of March 2014. So I think a hard copy should be available to you. Do you see that? So it's a letter, Mott MacDonald, signed by Richard Cantlay for the attention of Mr Brian Curry. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And so the bold heading, re-provision of RHSC and DCN at Little France evaluation. If we skip the section with the bullet points, you see a paragraph beginning, we believe.
Yeah.
So it says, we believe from a technical perspective, the technical evaluation has been carried out consistent with the evaluation methodology. From our involvement in this process, we consider the scores awarded for the technical evaluation criteria, design and construction, and facilities management proposals to be appropriate. Therefore, from a technical perspective, it appears appropriate for the board to conclude the evaluation process and appoint the bidder identified as having the most economically advantageous tender. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now, having seen that letter, do you remember issuing that letter to NHS Lothian?
Vaguely remember issuing it, yeah, because I remember thinking about, what it was that we were confirming, and reading it now, it makes sense. It's confirming that the bits of the evaluation that we had been involved in, as far as we were concerned, had been done in, alignment with the methodology.
Thank you. And then if I can ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 10, Volume 1, page 5. So this is a set of minutes for the NHS Lothian's Finance and Resources Committee from the 5th of March 2014. So Bundle 10, Volume 1, page 5. Finance and Resources Committee from the 5th of March 2014. You were listed as in attendance. And if we could look on, please, to paragraph 61.10, which is on page 6. Bottom paragraph, beginning Mr Cantlay. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Mr Cantlay, representing Mott MacDonald, advised the committee that as technical advisor for the re-provision of the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences at Little France NPD project, he believed from a technical perspective that the technical evaluation had been carried out in a manner consistent with the evaluation methodology. From their involvement in this process, the considered scores awarded for the technical evaluation criteria seemed to be correct, and it appeared appropriate for the board to conclude the evaluation process and appoint the bidder identified as having the most economically advantageous tender as the preferred bidder. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now, having seen that minute, do you remember anything about this meeting? Do you remember making those statements?
I remember, vaguely remember attending that meeting, yeah, and that minute and the letter are very much saying the same thing, yeah.
And again, just for completeness, if we look over the page to page 7, paragraph 61.20, towards the bottom, it says Mr Cantlay confirmed that the scores were all appropriate and he was happy with the evaluation and satisfied that the preferred bidder was in full accordance with the requirements. Do you see that?
Yep.
Again, from what you've told us, would it be fair to say that you are leading the project, but in a sense, for some of this, you're relying on what you've been told by colleagues within Mott MacDonald who were involved at the more granular level of detail in the assessment?
Correct, yeah.
So from this point, whereby the preferred bidder is appointed, I think you mentioned earlier that your role in the project was perhaps slightly diminished from that point on. Are you still involved in effectively your role as the lead technical advisor, but is this the point whereby some of your colleagues are taking on more of the day-to-day responsibilities?
Yeah, so I think at this point, this is when Graham, who'd obviously been involved in the project from, I think, round about competitive dialogue round 3 and then through the evaluation, this is really when he would took over, so that phasing happened over dialogue. So I was very much, leading pre-procurement. He was very much leading the preferred bidder on, and I guess it was a transfer over that period. So to answer your question, yeah. So I wasn't, from memory, involved in the day-to-day at this point at all, and I basically was there to give Graham some, support, advice, benefit of my experience having, done this in a number of other projects.
And in terms of your interactions with Mr Greer, do you remember him raising any significant concerns about the project in the period from preferred bidder until financial close? Yeah,
so, and again, I can't remember specifics, but the general theme of conversations we would have been having would have been him, raising things he wanted to seek guidance or a view on. And I guess, the general flavour of those conversations was about, the challenge of getting the right, or what he considered to be the right level of detail in the design for inclusion in the contract. So what becomes project co-proposals. And then, so that was the general flavour, and then associated with that, there was a whole load of sub-points which were going into technical detail. And I guess, sorry, that's the answer to my question. I was going to say what happened next.
We can come on and discuss that in a second. I think one thing I'd be interested in your views on, you're having these discussions with Mr Greer, he's raising issues cropping up in the project, including the level of technical detail. From your perspective, the types of discussions you're having, are these issues that are part and parcel of a big infrastructure project, or were there specific issues that were really ringing alarm bells on this specific project?
think almost every project, revenue funded project I've been involved in, there is always this tension between how much design data you can get up to the point of financial close. Both through the bid period when bidders are in a competitive environment, and so all at their own cost, and only one of them is going to be successful. So you need to be reasonable in terms of how much you can ask bidders to do and what level of design you can expect them to underdo at risk. When that goes into the preferred bidder to financial close stage, that risk diminishes somewhat for the private sector bidder in that they are identified as a preferred bidder, but I guess there is still a risk that they never get to contract. And bearing in mind the way the payment works under a revenue-funded project. And so there's always, therefore, this tension, which is the procuring authority trying to get enough to allow them to, be confident. But then the preferred bidder, and I'm not speaking about this particular product, I'm just talking about generally at the moment, and then the preferred bidder wanting to develop it, effectively still at their own cost. So that is a natural tension that exists on every, revenue-funded project. So there was probably some of that, which I've experienced in all projects. And then there was probably some project-specific areas as well. So answer to your question is probably a bit of both.
Okay. Because, again, the inquiry's heard evidence from a variety of witnesses whereby there came a point really from the summer of 2014 to Christmas 2014 whereby it seemed that there was a mismatch in expectations, that's how it was described, between NHS Lothian on one side and IHSL and Multiplex on the other, a mismatch in expectations in terms of what one wanted to be provided and what the other party was prepared to provide. In the discussions you're having with Mr Greer, though, did you view that as simply part and parcel of a big infrastructure project, or were there specific issues, specific concerns with this project that made it stand out from the rest?
Well, I dare say mismatch of expectations it's probably not the first time whether it was using that exact terminology in other projects, I've heard that before. So, as I said in my last answer, that to some extent is, something that, does happen on, generally on other projects. In terms of here, I guess there was, and while that often happens in every project, there's always specific parties involved on any particular project, and so I probably just reiterate my last answer. I think it was a combination of what we always see, and then some specific, project-specific issues as well. But I can't, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but, I just think it was a combination of those two things.
Mr Greer explained to the inquiry that his understanding of the way of resolving that issue was by putting a number of issues into reviewable design data. Do you remember having any discussions with Mr Greer about the volume of reviewable design data for this project and whether it was more or less than would be anticipated in a project of this nature?
Again, I can't recall specifics, but I certainly, I do recall conversations around, one way of dealing with a lack of detail is to require it to be dealt with post-financial close. The bidder has put forward a bid for effectively a fixed price, and whether they sort it out pre or post-financial close, it's, effectively they're taking the same risk around about that. So one way of dealing with areas which perhaps haven't been developed as much as, ideally you would have liked was to, reserve the position, ask it to be put through the RDD and make sure that the board is not being exposed to any more risk than they would have had they agreed at pre-financial close. And then the more you do of that, the more RDD there is. I don't specifically remember a conversation which was around you're going to have too much RDD to be able to do anything with. I don't remember that. To me, what I probably recall is a conversation round about make sure that, we're protecting the board through that RDD process contractually.
And do you remember any issues being raised with you in the period from the preferred bidder appointment to financial close about the fitness for purpose of the ventilation system in particular?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So again, we're in the period from preferred bidder to financial close. Do you remember in that period any specific issues being raised with you in relation to the fitness for purpose, the ventilation design?
I probably do have vague memory of that being one of a number of things that were getting dealt with in that period from PB to financial close. Not being my area of technical expertise, I wouldn't have necessarily been able to get involved and help and solve it technically. But to answer your question, yes, he would have made me aware that one of the issues that we're dealing with in the run-up to financial close would have related to ventilation.
Okay. So again, we're going to ask you to look at a couple of documents, Mr. Cantlay. If you've not seen them before, you don't remember them, please do just say, but it's really in fairness to you to try and orientate where I want to go with this current discussion. If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 8, page 71. This is a document that was created in November of 2014 by Mr McRae, who was a mechanical engineer with Mott MacDonald. And it's really just the final entry under the table. You see a section that says Mott MacDonald's concern is that the room will be at slight positive pressure to the corridor, which would allow infections such as MRSA or norovirus to spread. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So the way Mr McRae explained it was he had done a sampling exercise on the preferred bidder's solution and had identified an issue in terms of a possible risk of spread of MRSA or norovirus. Do you remember any such issue cropping up in terms of your involvement in the project? Was that something that was escalated to you?
I don't recall this document or a specific conversation around about that, no.
The only reason I raise it is if we think back to the confirmation that Hulley and Kirkwood had given, which was effectively to say our design, our environmental matrix complies with all published guidance, including HTMs, SHTMs. IHSL as preferred bidder doesn't make any changes to the environmental matrix. Get to the point in the preferred bidder stage whereby one of the engineers within Mott MacDonald spots an issue with the design solution for the ventilation system that might give rise to a risk of spread of MRSA or norovirus. Are you slightly surprised that within Mott MacDonald that's not a red flag, that there might have been problems with the information in the environmental matrix produced by Hulley and Kirkwood?
I mean, just, thinking about it, I guess this is a level of detail conversation, isn't it? So we were pre-procurement, we're then in procurement, we're then into a stage of that design being developed to another level of detail. So is it a surprise that this issue was raised at this point in time? No, not really, because I suspect the conversations at this point of time were getting into that next level of detail as the preferred bidder developed their design. it's going into more detail, and therefore any review by the board and their team is going into, and there would just naturally be more detailed conversations taking place, I think.
The next document I'd ask you to have in front of you is Bundle 10, Volume 1 at page 283. Again, this is a healthcare-associated infection system for controlling risk in the built environment, HAI Scribe report from the 19th of November 2014. Do you see that?
Yeah.
I'm now talking about the period up to financial close. Do you remember seeing this document in that period?
I don't recall, no.
Have you seen the document subsequent to that period?
I'm not sure I did. I presume, I don't know at what stages the high scribe reviews were carried out, but if there was one carried out on the reference design, then again it would have been in that ring fence team. I definitely can't recall seeing this document or necessarily ones before it if they exist.
The reason I take you to the document is if we look a couple of pages on to page 286, you'll see entry 2.2, and it says, is the ventilation system design fit for purpose given the potential for infection spread via the ventilation systems? And that's ticked as no. Again, is this a document that would be dealt with more at the project level? This isn't something you'd be expecting to be escalated to your level within the project?
Sorry, I'm just reading the... Yeah, well, what was the date of this? Sorry,
It's the 19th of November 2014.
19th, right? Okay, so yeah, and going by the note, it sounds like there's a question over: is there a potential? And then it sounds like there's proposals sought from the preferred bidder to give more detail to answer those questions. So I think my reading of it, you know, and again, I haven't seen this before, my reading of it is that there's a question to be asked, which in terms of answering that question, there is additional design data being sought. So I guess it would have been perhaps escalated to myself if, you know, the answering of that question still left an issue, and I don't know whether it did or not.
If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 8, page 84. This is a document headed Design Risks to the Board to Financial Close. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Do you remember seeing this document and this type of document, so risk registers in the period to financial close, or was this the type of document that would be dealt with by others within Mott MacDonald, given the relatively high level that you were adopting in relation to the project?
So this would be the sort, you know, this document's not an unusual document to be in existence at this time. You know, identifying risks. I can't recall whether I saw it on this version on this project at this point in time, but you know, thinking back to conversations, I do, you know, recall the concept, or you know, Graham talking about how there was, you know, we're recording these sorts of risks in a register, you know, to support NHS Lothian in terms of understanding them and considering what to do with them. So Well, I can't remember the specific document on this project. This document isn't an unusual one for me.
If we just look at the first entry, so the categories M&E, the items ventilation, and the risk impact is described as high. And it says the single room with ensuite ventilation design shall comply with the parameters set out in SHTM 0301. So potential issue of non-compliance with SHTM 0301. Would it surprise you that at this stage in the project, just before financial close, that there's a potential issue around non-compliance with SHTM 0301, given the confirmation that Hulley and Kirkwood had given way back in 2013?
Again, I'd probably go back to my answer of 3 or 4 questions ago, which is, the procurement process, the design is developing as we go through the procurement process. And, therefore, the conversations and the design goes into more detail, and therefore the conversations go into more detail. Ultimately, the risk allocation associated with this sort of form of contract is that design risk sits with the private sector. And therefore, something like this, to me, it's clear that where the responsibility lies for sorting out any issue like this. But is it a surprise that this is on this risk register? And no, I don't necessarily think it is. It's just that it's an issue that has been flagged given a more detailed conversation about ventilation than has happened in the project so far.
So just in the period before financial close, various key stage reviews take place, and then there's the final business case that needs to get approved effectively for the money to be provided for the project. Were you aware that your letter of the 4th of March 2014 that we looked at had been included as an appendix to the final business case?
Don't recall if I was aware or not.
Just given some of the risks that we've looked at on that risk register, would you be surprised if the letter in an unqualified form went in without some of those risks also being identified, or was that not part of your role to make that assessment?
Yeah, but so the letter you refer to is March 2014, and this document we're referring to is January 2015. And during that time, there is more detailed design being developed. And, again, referring back, naturally then the project and the people involved in the project are going into more levels of detail. If you go back to the letter that is of the 4th of March, this is me confirming on the behalf of my team that I believe the evaluation has been carried out in accordance with the evaluation methodology. We covered C21, which is how do you, look at compliance? Do you take it at face value? So that's all underpinning this letter. To me, this comes back to the project now going to the next level of detail and flagging an issue that now is seen as an issue, which was deemed to be or wasn't known at a previous point because the conversations at a previous point weren't involved in that level of detail.
Yes, so absolutely. The letter of 4th of March 2014, that's a snapshot in time. Do you remember either yourself or anyone at Mock McDonald being asked to give an updated assurance just immediately prior to financial close in relation to the technical issues on the project?
Can't recall. I certainly don't remember doing that. I do remember this letter. I do remember the meeting. I can't recall anything pre-financial close.
And just in terms of your experience of revenue-funded projects, would it be normal for that advice to be refreshed just before the contract signed, or is that not something that happens on a revenue-funded project?
No, I can't necessarily recall, and I've been on a number of projects which have reached financial close. I can't necessarily recall, a need to provide a statement like that at financial close.
Thank you, Mr Cantlay. There's just two more issues that I want to cover, and they're slightly out of order from the rest of the matters that I've been asking you about. The first is, if I could ask you to have in front of you, please, bundle 2 at page 605. This is a paper headed RHSC and DCN Approach to Reference Design. Do you see that from May 2012?
Yep.
I'd ask you to look on to page 626, please. After the bullet points, first full paragraph, approximately 4 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, it's the text in yellow. Do you see text beginning similarly the environmental matrix? So it says, similarly, the environmental matrix specifies parameters and criteria to be met and for which the bidders will be required to advise the levels that will be achieved in their particular design. Now that was obviously the intention at that point in time. That changed. Can you remember when that intention changed?
Sorry, which...
So we're looking at the text in yellow that says, similar, the environmental matrix specifies parameters and criteria that need to be met and for which the bidders will be required to advise the levels that will be achieved in their particular design. So that reads as suggesting that at one point in time, it was going to be a fixed document. You told us in your evidence that changed, that wasn't the intention. I was just trying to understand when the thinking changed.
Yeah, okay. I mean, my reading of that is still alluding to the fact that bidders will be required to advise the levels that they will achieve in their design, the second half of that yellow highlighted writing. But to answer your question then, can I just see actually the date of this or the version of this document?
Certainly, so if we go back to, I think it's page 605.
Because this is it
was May 2012.
Can you just, I was just keen to see what revision or version, because there was a number.
So if we go to page 607, this is revision F. So I think it went on to revision J eventually, but what we're looking at here is revision F.
Yeah.
So page 607.
Yeah, so, and maybe it's helpful just to be clear about what this document is. So this document, and I think it goes all the way back to, in fact, it's the first question you asked me after lunch about advice on use of reference design, etc. So what this paper was trying to do was absolutely get agreement, NHS, Lothian side, as to how we will use the reference design as part of the procurement process. And, so this paper, when I say Lothian side, I mean the Lothian project team, so people from NHS Lothian, ourselves, other advisors, etc. So what this paper is doing, I would refer to this as a, internal advisory paper. I don't mean internal to Mott MacDonald, I mean internal to the NHS Lothian project team. It's trying to provide an audit trail of how we end up getting to an end position, which is that which we set out in the ITPD. A bidder doesn't really need to understand why we got to the answer that we got to. They need to understand what the answer is we got to, as reflected in the ITPD. This document was helping us get agreement on what that answer was going to be. And by answer, I'm talking about how we're going to use a reference design in the procurement process. So this changed a number of times from day one on the project all the way through to, right, we're now finishing finalising the ITPD, what is the final position? And, I remember this document took twists and turns as people fed back and what about this and what about that and what about this other consideration. And, there was also conversations, I think, with SFT about this document. So to me, this document is a means to an end, the end being what is set out in the ITPD. Can I recall what happened at each iteration? As you say, I think it went up to revision J. I can't remember each. If I tracked back and read every single one, I would be able to confirm what each change was. But things were moving around. And to me, you know, if we're talking about the environmental matrix and whether it is mandatory or not, you know, it's clearly not in there in terms of the ITPD, and therefore it's a positive decision not to make that mandatory.
And again, just finally within this document, if we look on to page 642, you see this is various deliverables. So one deliverable there, the second entry, is room data sheets. You see in the notes section, RDS for all rooms and space types. Was there a point in time where the thinking was that there would be a full suite of room data sheets that were provided?
Early, yeah. That, yeah, and that was probably, so yes, at a point in time for discussion, you know, while these issues were all still getting debated, how do we use the reference design? How do we avoid cutting across the risk profile that is needed in a PPP or revenue funded project?
And again, I think as you've said, purpose of this document, internal document, developing thinking and showing a snapshot of thinking in time, but that changes by the time we get to the ITPD that we've looked at.
Yeah, it's a means to an end. The important point is what the end was.
Thank you, Mr Cantlay. There's just one final issue that I'd want to raise at this stage, and it's really a general point looking for your observations given your experience working with revenue funded projects and your knowledge from this project in particular. So NHS Lothian's position before the inquiry is that they accept that there was an error in some spreadsheet values that starts right at the start of the project and it doesn't get spotted through the procurement stages and into the point at financial close when the contract is concluded. From your perspective, how could such issues be avoided or mitigated in future projects of a similar nature?
That's a big question. But, I mean, there's a whole series of sort of things that the industry could do to move on, whether it is the, you know, pulling together the healthcare specific design guidance, you know, because at the moment design guidance is this in Scotland is this kind of combination of, well, it's, you comply with the SHTM unless there's, and if there's not one, you comply with the English HTM unless the SHTM's about old, you know, and there's this kind of, it's quite a confusing sort of guidance situation. There is obviously, you know, ADB, you know, one school of thought through this inquiry is if you use ADB, then everything's going to be fine. But I think there's also another clear school of thought that actually ADB isn't necessarily the answer to all things and doesn't necessarily mean there won't be mistakes. You know, there's so many different opportunities to think about how you do it that I'm you know, in answer to your question, I don't have any specifics here and now as to what we should do to avoid, you know, anything happening like this. There's lots of opportunities, and I know people, you know, people approach these projects with best endeavours. Everybody wants to make, you know, it a success. This project was particularly complicated given the, well, for a number of reasons. Its history and getting to where it had got to before it became MPD. The fact it was going on to a very complicated site, both physically and contractually. And, you know, healthcare buildings are complicated in themselves. So, you know, how do we avoid things like this in the future? I think there's a whole plethora of opportunities, and that would, you know, I'd have to go away and think about them in detail to give you a response that, you know, merits the question.
Thank you very much, Mr Cantlay. I don't have any further questions at this stage. Lord Brodie may have some questions, or equally there might be applications from core participants, but at this stage, thank you for answering my questions today.
Thank you.
I don't have any further questions at this point, Mr Cantlay, but what I propose to do is to allow the other legal representatives in the room to consider their positions as to whether there's anything further they would wish to be raised. So we'll take a break and sit again at about 3:30, and Mr McGregor should then be in a position either to say there are no further questions or make the arrangement for such further questioning. So if I could ask you to retire to the witness room, and we'll see each other again at 3:30.
Yeah, thank you.
Please stand.
Mr McGregor?
Lord Brew, there's one point of detail that I've been asked to clarify, which I'm content to do. Beyond that, I wouldn't anticipate there being any applications made.
I'll ask Mr Cantlay to join us again. Mr Cantlay, I understand there's just one further matter which Mr McGregor will ask you about. Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Lord Brew. Mr Cantlay, there's just one small point of clarification. If we could go back to bundle 2 and to page 86, please, which was the contract between Lothian Health Board and Mott MacDonald Limited, and zoom in and look at entry 16, which is the check reference design for compliance with all appropriate NHSL and legislative guidelines and requirements. List as pre-agreed with NHSL and identify any derogations. Do you see that?
Yep.
Now, there's an entry just a few boxes along, which is for the man days allocated to that. It's 5 days. Do you see that?
Yep.
I think you'd mentioned in your evidence that that would include checking with Hulley and Kirkwood that there was compliance with all relevant published guidance. Do you know what, if anything, else Mott MacDonald would have done in the 5 days that were allocated?
No, as I say, what I understand from that task, given the number of days, is that it is not an independent check by any stretch of the imagination. It is getting to a point where we can be clear that the reference design is, in compliance. And so my understanding of the days, I don't necessarily know what the 5 days were envisaged to do at the time this was drafted, but my understanding of how the time was spent was doing what I described earlier, i.e. getting confirmation from the reference design team consultants that they believed that they had complied with the guidance and to list out any derogations.
Thank you, Mr Cantlay. I don't have any further questions, but thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Cantlay. You're now free to go, but before leaving us, can I add my thanks for your attendance today, but also for the preparation that went into your witness statement. I appreciate that it's not just a question of a few hours answering questions. It's a lot of work, so thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think a few words on the procedure which I would propose we should follow. Now, as I think you're aware, I am not proposing to hold oral hearings in order to hear closing statements. But I do invite closing statements from all core participants who wish to provide them. Now, Mr McGregor will correct me on the timetable as I understand it. The counsel to the inquiry will begin the process by drafting a written closing statement, which will be circulated by the 2nd of June. Core participants are expected to exchange draft closing statements amongst themselves by the 16th of June. And core participants are required to submit their closing statements to the inquiry by 30th of June. So the 2nd of June statement from counsel to the inquiry, 16th of June expected circulation among the core participants, and 30th of June core participants to submit their closing statements to the inquiry. The next hearing, as the inquiry has already given notice of, will relate to Glasgow and will begin on the 12th of June. Now, as core participants will appreciate, notwithstanding hearings, investigation continues, both in relation to Glasgow and the Glasgow Hospital and the Edinburgh Hospital. As I think Mr. McGregor has previously indicated, the next phase, or if he hasn't, I'm now indicating it, the next phase in relation to Edinburgh will be particularly focusing on the decision of the Cabinet Secretary to postpone the opening of the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People, in that decision being in July 2019, and the subsequent decision to open the hospital. Now, I continue to value the cooperation of core participants. The progress of the inquiry and the eventual utility of the inquiry depends in large part on that participation. The next hearing in relation to Edinburgh, we hope to hold in the course of this year. I mean, it's perhaps not possible to go beyond that at today's date, but we will make a formal announcement as soon as possible. Mr. McGregor, is there anything that occurs to you that I should have said, or?
No, nothing else more.
Right. And I take it nothing immediately arises. Well, thank you for your attendance. We shall be seeing each other again, but meantime, have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Please stand.